Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks from Braintree High School, and this is going to be a screencast on World War II and specifically the role that African Americans played in the war. Now, that is a very complicated question. What role did African Americans play in World War II? We're going to do the best we can to answer it. Now, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese are going to launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Yes, Pearl Harbor located in Hawaii, and ultimately that's going to be where our Pacific Fleet is going to be located. The Pacific Fleet will mostly be destroyed on December 7th, the day that will live in infamy. Of course, FDR's famous statement. So after that, we're going to need more soldiers because we certainly are not going to have enough to fight the Germans and the Japanese at the same time. So that brings us to encouraging people to sign up, and we did. The United States had millions and millions of volunteers, but ultimately not enough, so a draft was needed. And ultimately, that draft will get enough soldiers to win this war. Now, African Americans, over 1 million will be drafted and or will have volunteered, but in the end, 1 million will have served, but it will not be equal. There's going to be a massive amount of prejudice, and that is unfortunate. So let's look at the five major parts of the U.S. military, and let's go to the U.S. Marines first. The U.S. Marines, a very prestigious branch of the military, and they did not allow African Americans to serve during World War II. Certainly not an equitable policy or equal, and that's, of course, an ugly stain on our military's record. Now, if you look at the U.S. Navy did allow African Americans to serve. They were welcome to volunteer and be drafted. However, they were not allowed to be in combat positions. In fact, there was a lot of people were scared. White racists were scared about arming African Americans and giving them access to modern military equipment. So they were not allowed to fight in combat positions. There was also a lot of people that felt that they were not prepared and would not be able to fight as effectively as white soldiers at the time. A whole lot of prejudice. So basically, they were able to sign up in the Navy and be stewards, essentially glorified butlers, and or work in the kitchen as cooks and whatnot. So again, not an equal situation, certainly not a happy moment in history. So now let's look at the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Army did allow African Americans to serve. They were welcome, but again, they were in segregated units, and those segregated units were not allowed to see combat. African Americans, even eventually, when they could see combat, were given white commanders. So in the end, they weren't even allowed to be in charge of themselves. Not an equal or equitable policy, and of course, an ugly stain on the Army's history. So now let's look at the U.S. Air Force, which wasn't technically its own branch at the time. It was part of the other branches, but the flying groups, African Americans were not welcomed at first, but eventually welcomed. But they were under total segregation. They were not allowed to integrate with white pilots. They were in their own units and so on. Again, segregation is a pretty ugly stain in U.S. history and the military in this context. Now, because of this discrimination, African Americans were conflicted at the time of World War II. So, and that's because of the hypocrisy. So, Eleanor Roosevelt said it best that the nation cannot expect colored people to feel that the United States is worth defending if the Negro continues to be treated as he is now. So, here are a few statements by African Americans at the time. Just carve on my tombstone, here lies a black man killed fighting a yellow man for the protection of the white man. Again, we don't use that language today, but again, creative way just to say that this is unfair, a country dictated by color. Why die for democracy when some foreign country why die for democracy for some foreign country when we don't even have it here? Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Is this the kind of America I know worth defending? Will America be true and pure democracy after this war? Will colored Americans suffer still the indignities that have been heaped upon them in the past? So this is a way of people saying, why would I fight unless I have a promise that things will be better in the future? The Army Jim Crows us. Employers and labor unions shut us out. Lynchings continue. What more could Hitler do to us than that? Why is Hitler my enemy? But still, amongst all that conflict, over 1 million African Americans did sign up to be a part of this war. They enlisted in an army that was fighting a war against racism with a segregated army. And that's definitely going to be the peak of hypocrisy, right? So, without a doubt, African American protesters are going to highlight that we were selling this war as a war for democracy, a war against racism, the racism of fascism and of Hitlerism. And still, that's going to show to be very inconsistent. We were in a society claiming we were the good guys when we treated African Americans unbelievably terribly bad. And that's really going to highlight some of the hypocrisy in America. So, We kept blaming Hitler for the inequities he enforced in his society, yet we were doing the same thing. So African Americans are going to fight back, specifically, and one group's going to start an organized movement out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's going to be a newspaper at the time, an African American newspaper called the Pittsburgh Courier. The Pittsburgh Courier is going to start what's called the Double V campaign. They're going to name it. And the double V kind of comes from Winston Churchill's symbol of putting two fingers up in the shape of a V, which is how he said victory. We must never surrender. We will fight on until victory. So the Double V campaign is the Double Victory campaign, victory abroad and victory at home. What that meant was victory over the racism abroad of fascism and victory at home over racism at home. So we're going to fight Hitler, and we're also going to fight the segregation and prejudice that is in the United States of America. Now, what were some of the ways that people were inspired by the Double V campaign? Well, there were some instances where African Americans refused to pay taxes towards a racist government managing a racist society. Other examples where people did sit-ins, or should I say large protests to fight against segregation during the war. So the Double V campaign led to all types of protests. It was just the beginning of an organized effort to get people to fight back against what would prove to be a very racist and unfair society in the 40s and 50s. So by no means was the Double V movement unbelievably successful, but it did start taking the first steps of getting people thinking and being mindful of the hypocrisy and ready to fight. And that is a long road to travel down, but it will be a road traveled down, and they kind of started it. So what problems existed on the home front in the relation to African Americans? Well, let's look at it. So we talked about enlistment and hypocrisy. Now we're going to talk about segregation on the home front. So number one, the German Empire, eventually many of those soldiers are going to surrender, right? And they're going to become prisoners of war. And when you become a prisoner of war by the international law, you have to be taken care of, your medical care, your food. So these prisoners of war are going to come to the United States. And the United States had POW camps everywhere for German prisoners of war and whatnot, and even Japanese prisoners of war. But as you can see, these dots, they're all over the place. So what was shameful about these POW camps? Well, Jim Crow laws of the South, really. So when there was segregation, whether on trains or in coffee houses, wherever it was, African American soldiers that actually were Americans fighting for our country were often denied access to various restaurants or train cars because of segregation. Yet the Nazi prisoners, those that worked for Hitler and that were being captured, they were allowed to go in those places. And they would often sit right next to the white American soldiers. And it's just a blatant example of racism, of how even our Nazi prisoners were being treated better by our country than the African American soldiers. They were risking their lives to fight for their country. So there are so many instances of that. These are some examples of Nazi POWs eating. And again, African American soldiers weren't allowed there because of segregation. So similar examples to transportation. It was just all over the place where African American soldiers often were second to even the POWs, which is a really, really, really sad reality. So in addition to enlistment and the hypocrisy of the reasons we were fighting this war and the segregation on the home front, African Americans, there was a shining light, a good thing. There were new employment opportunities. So Americans' factories before the war, 75% of these factories rejected and did not allow African Americans to work there. Remember that whole Depression saying, last hired, first fired. Well, in 1941, the end of the Depression, and the war begins, the United States has to produce a massive amount of war goods, right? Like a lot of war goods. And we needed 6.5 million workers to do it. So who's going to fill those jobs? I mean, this is the same time where white workers were going away to Europe and to the Pacific. So women stepped it up by the millions, and they started working in the factories and proving that they were potentially equal. But it still wasn't enough worker to get all the supplies that we needed for the war. We were desperate. So we still kept looking, and at this point, industry started to hire African Americans. Their prejudice prevented them from doing it before, but now they were desperate to make money. So African Americans were hired, and this is where millions of African Americans are actually going to migrate up from the South to take those jobs in northern cities, Midwestern cities, and California, of course. And they're going to be hired, getting an opportunity they had never had before. So 6 million African Americans are going to get those jobs. That's a good thing. And here's some images of African Americans working in the industry, getting opportunities they'd always been denied of before. And these opportunities to work is going to allow them to make more money, which impacts a lot of life, improves standard of living, where they can live and how they can live. That's going to be a really positive thing. Now, It's far from perfect, but it was a small step in the right direction. African Americans being able to get jobs and prove that they were equal and able to do the things that white people could do, and hopefully employers would continue to keep them employed after the war. Malcolm X, the civil rights leader of the 1960s, is going to famously say that when asked, he asked me, did I feel like any white men had ever done anything for the black man in America? I told him, yes, I can think of two, Hitler and Stalin. The black man in America couldn't get a decent factory job until Hitler put so much pressure on the white man, and then Stalin kept up the pressure. So again, it's a famous Malcolm X quote basically acknowledging that Adolf Hitler, by starting this war, is going to inadvertently provide some opportunities for African Americans and a huge step forward economically. It's going to change American society. Not to say that Hitler didn't do isn't all bad, but that's a accidental good that he started this kind of change for African American society in America. 6 million African Americans ultimately are going to get these jobs, and that's going to be a massive change socioeconomically. That's a good thing, at least for a start. So we've talked about enlistment, the hypocrisy of our ideology in this country as compared with Germany, segregation on the home front for those POWs, new employment opportunities. Now let's talk about discrimination in the factories. So we had so many factories, and there was a problem. African American workers working in these factories were making less money than their white counterparts doing the exact same job. Blatant discrimination. So that's a problem. So that not only were they making less money, but they were also facing job discrimination. All the great jobs were going to white candidates and workers, and the menial, low-paying ones were being given to African Americans. So here's one quote from one company: Negroes will be considered as janitors, declared the general manager of North American Aviation. It is company policy. So it's not even opinion or happenstance, it's a policy. So will anybody do anything about this? And there will be somebody, and his name is going to be A. Philip Randolph. There he is, slightly older than World War II. He's about 20 years older at that time. And he's going to get angry. He's going to be like, all right, I need to fight against this. African Americans should have equal access to all of these jobs. So he's going to organize a movement to basically protest against the inequities of the war industry. And these protests are going to get the attention of FDR, and he's going to get an invitation, A. Philip Randolph, to go to the White House. And FDR is going to meet with him and talk with him. And A. Philip Randolph's basically going to say, you need to fix this problem. This is not okay that we get paid less for the same work and have less access to jobs. In fact, he even threatens FDR, if you don't do something about it, I'm going to get hundreds of thousands of African Americans to go to protest in Washington, D.C. We're going to do a march on Washington and basically protest. Now, FDR remembered the Bonus Army and those protests, and that wasn't a good thing. So ultimately, FDR does not want that to happen. It's kind of a dangerous thing to have that large of a protester right around him. And the March on Washington would be embarrassing. It would draw attention to how racist American society is and how inequitable it is. And in a war, in a world where you're trying to win over allies to go up against the racist jerks of Germany, you do not want that to be your defining characteristic. The reputation of the U.S. would be destroyed. U.S. strength comes from solidarity, everybody working together, particularly in a time of war. And this March on Washington would be divisive and make the United States weaker. So to avoid a March on Washington, A. Philip Randolph's protest, FDR is going to take action. Thank you, A. Philip Randolph, for putting the pressure on him. Executive Order 8802. Now, Executive Order 8802, these executive orders are not laws, they are orders. The presidents are in charge of an entire government, and they can tell any member of the government what to do. And that's what this is. They sometimes are comparable to laws, but they're different. So either way, there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in the defense industry or the government, or discrimination in the government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. Creed being, of course, the word for religion. So why would this change anything, FDR making an executive order and telling people you can't be racist anymore? Well, the U.S. government is going to create, something to enforce it. It's going to be called the Committee on Fair Employment Practice. So this new group of people is going to have power to basically go in and shut down businesses, to investigate acts of racism, to fine them. So what does it do exactly? Just what I said. The South had lots of African American workers. They faced massive discrimination. And basically, if you face that discrimination or inequitable pay, you could call this group up, you call them up, the Committee on Fair Employment Practice, and they will investigate, they will call witnesses, and ultimately they will basically call out any factory that is operating inequitably. and they can shut them down. So this is one way to fix this, right? It basically empowered people to be like, you know what, I don't want to get in trouble. I'm going to have to pay everybody the same, and that's a good thing. So outcome, the United States is going to have lots of factories and millions of workers, and African Americans for the first time ever can demand some level of equity, and the government has their back. So it's obviously only a small step. There's many steps still to take after that, but it was a step in the right direction. So thank you, A. Philip Randolph, with your threats to do a march on Washington and the pressure you put on FDR. So that said, that was a very positive thing, right? Just as an aside, Philip Randolph actually canceled his march on Washington because FDR gave that executive order. So March on Washington would still happen, but 20 years later under the leadership of Martin Luther King. So we've talked about enlistment, hypocrisy of ideology, segregation on the home front with POWs, new employment opportunities after the Great Migration, and discrimination in factories, which hopefully were cleaned up. So with that executive order. So also another thing to talk about is African Americans were not allowed to fight in combat positions or in unsegregated areas. So in 1941, 1 million African Americans signed up, but they were not allowed to fight. They were not allowed to be trained or to hold basically professional weapons because a lot of people in white society did not want to see African Americans professionally trained or used to dealing with modern military equipment. So African Americans were put into non-combat positions. Examples like unloading military ships or driving supply trucks or transporting troops or maintenance jobs, fixing light bulbs, things like that. So in 1944, but progress is about to be made. Now, what happened that allowed African Americans to play a stronger role in the military? The United States now had done D-Day and was invading Germany. And in the middle of that invasion of Germany was going to be the biggest battle of the war called the Battle of the Bulge. Battle of the Bulge was when the United States was pushing towards Germany, and Hitler put together one last offense, and he drove almost right through American lines, suddenly pushed us back in the opposite direction. So that's going to result in 75,000 casualties. Basically, people wounded bad enough that they couldn't be soldiers anymore, at least temporarily. So the United States at this point needed soldiers because we had lost so many and the war wasn't over yet that they got an idea. Why don't we allow African Americans to fight in combat positions? Also, why don't we start integrating them into white units and that they're going to fight on a desegregated side for much of the war at this point. They're going to go back to segregation after the war, but so ultimately the African American troops are going to be able to fight. Now, that integration is a powerful thing. And again, that's going to be a positive thing. So African Americans were allowed to fight and so on. And that's a good thing. Like I said, 1945, the U.S. is going to win the war. But either way, once World War II ends, a sad aspect of that is the U.S. Army is no longer desperate. So they segregate troops again. African Americans that are soldiers have to be in their own units, which are a very ugly stain on U.S. history. And that's going to stay the same way from 1945 to 46 to 47 to 48. Segregation is going to be there. And why? Well, the generals basically were highly prejudiced, many of them from the South, but either way, many of them supported segregation and did not want to end segregation because they thought that was the American way. They had fear of violence. They knew that white people often didn't like black people and black people didn't like white people. And they were worried that this would create fights within the military branches. Group cohesion was the number one argument. The idea that when you're in the military, you're only as good as the person to your left and right. You have to work with each other or you might get killed. So ultimately, again, if either one of these guys screws up, then it leaves the other one unguarded, and that's just unacceptable. So many of the generals were like, African Americans aren't getting along with white Americans, they're not going to trust each other, and that's going to be a negative thing. But then in 1948, African American soldiers, still segregated, started to threaten to boycott the military. And the U.S. needed African American soldiers. They were a heavy percentage of the group. And Harry Truman, who was president then because FDR had died, issues his own executive order, 998-1. And that order basically tells the Army and the government, but the Army, to integrate, no more segregation. And that's only going to be a small step, but it's going to be a huge step at the same time. And the United States is going to be much better off. So now that African Americans were allowed to fight, particularly in desegregated areas, were there any specific celebrated groups? And so, yeah, let's look at it. The Tuskegee Airmen. So during World War I, African American soldiers were not allowed to be pilots. They were rejected. They were thought to not to be strong enough or mentally capable to handle it. But enough time would go by, and life sometimes gets better. And by 1939, there were lots of war protests, basically saying, Congress, let African Americans exist, let them fly planes. So that's what they do. They have a bill, they fund it to allow African American pilots to exist. So that said, it also provides ability for them to train, and that's going to be down all the way in Alabama at the Tuskegee Institute. That's where they're going to train to learn how to fly planes. So in 1941, a little time has passed after a few accidents that had occurred down at the Tuskegee Institute. Congress is going to be skeptical. They're going to say, these pilots, I told you so, African Americans can't fly planes, and they're going to cancel the program. Tuskegee Airmen are going to be out of business quicker than they were in business. But then Eleanor Roosevelt heard this, got wind of this, and actually drove and traveled all the way down to Tuskegee, Alabama. And when she showed up, she's like, I would like you to take me flying. And that African-American pilot took Eleanor Roosevelt flying around way up in the sky. And what did she get quoted as saying? You can fly all right. Basically saying, if the First Lady of the United States is willing to go up with African-American pilots, they must be safe, right? And this is going to keep Congress funding that program. So Tuskegee Airmen saved, and the United States is on its happy way allowing African American pilots to exist. So the U.S. Congress will continue funding that program. And in 1943, the Tuskegee Airmen are going to cross North Africa, and they're going to slowly help conquer North Africa. In 1944, they're going to cut into Sicily and then Italy. Ultimately, 922 fighter pilots are going to fight. And in the end, they're going to be nicknamed the Red Tail Angels because they specifically painted the tails of their planes red. And they are going to battle, and be bomber escorts, right? Bomber planes can do a lot more damage than fighter planes, but they're slow and easy to shoot down. So now you have the Red Tails and other groups like them fighting, going next to the bombers to escort them, to protect them. So either way, you can kind of see the difference here between the size of a bomber on the left and to the right, a fighter plane. So the Red Tails are going to take out 950 railway cars. That's going to be a significant offensive component of the war. Also, they're going to shoot down 112 German fighter planes, and they're going to take out 40 German ships. They only actually lost 27 bombers in all that time. It was an excellent rate. They really proved that African Americans could fly planes, and that will have ramifications on down the line. So these are, as positively as they did, they're going to start changing people's minds and making them happy, and they're going to inspire others to follow in their footsteps. And this is going to really lead to African Americans having lots more opportunities in the Air Force and so on. Now they're going to pave the path for the future and make changes, right? If you are interested in the Red Tails, there's a great movie called The Tuskegee Airmen with lots of famous actors. Highly recommended. And there's a much more modern movie called The Red Tails, and it's a less good movie, but it's got better CG. So both I highly recommend to learn more about this topic. Was there another famous group of African American infantry soldiers? And the answer is yeah, they were called the Black Panthers, and that's not related to the movie, and it's not related to the protest group of the 60s, although they may have been inspired by them. So the Black Panthers, before 1941, the United States was excuse me, before 1941, the United States had lots of racist feelings, right? They did not want African Americans learning how to use modern military equipment. So that's one reason why African Americans faced so much resistance being in the war, and getting combat positions, things like that. Well, anyway, African Americans were stuck with non-combat positions in World War I, and African American soldiers, of course, were kicked out of the U.S. military during World War I, and they weren't allowed to fight along white American civilians. And basically what happened is they were given to France. U.S. soldiers during World War I were given to France. They weren't even allowed to fight next to U.S. troops. They had to be against French. The U.S. military even warned the French soldiers not to treat the African American soldiers with too much respect, or otherwise they're going to want that when they get home, and that's not a good thing. So anyway, fast forward to 1941, a guy named Leslie McNair basically says, hey, I want to try this. I want to put together an African American infantry group that can successfully fight as well as any white soldiers. So these African American soldiers are going to do exactly that. They're going to train for combat, and they're going to be called the Black Panthers. And here's an example of the Black Panthers, right? With their tank unit in 1944, they became the first black combat group. And they're going to be one of the first groups to enter into German land, and they make it unbelievably far east. Not the farthest east, but a top couple. They received 391 decorations for heroism. Excuse me. And now, one of the most famous generals of World War II is a guy named George Patton, right? And he called the Black Panthers one of the most effective tank battalions in World War II. Now, this is a lot longer, but this is what George Patton said. Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut son of a bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Most of all, your race is looking forward to your success. Don't let them down, and damn you, don't let me down. They say it's a patriotic duty to die for your country. Well, let's see how many patriots we can make out of those German, jerks, I suppose. Now, however, Patton in private did say something more condescending, just kind of reflecting the Army view of African Americans at the time. They gave a good first impression, but I have no faith in the inherent fighting ability of the race. Individually, they were good soldiers, but I expressed my belief at the time and have never found the necessity of changing it, that a colored soldier cannot think fast enough to fight in armor. And that is complicated, right? So that said, things are slowly getting to be more equal. I mean, with the success of the Black Panthers and the Tuskegee Airmen, people start changing their minds, supporting more equity. It's going to inspire followers and, of course, paving the path for the future Black Panthers they are. So how else did life change for African Americans because of the war? Well, let's talk about the Great Migration. So during the war, the United States needed to make war goods, and then we needed 6.5 million workers, and white workers are going to be too busy going away to fight in Europe. So it created a whole lot of job openings, 1.6 million African Americans. So they're going to travel out of the South and into the Northeast, into the cities, into the West. And that's going to be known as the Great Migration. Famous pictures depicting the Great Migration. People just picked up all their stuff and left. Now, that said, as you can see here, the Great Migration is going to deplete the South of a higher percentage of African Americans. And as you can see, the percentage of those of African Americans living in the South is going to drastically go down, starting with the Great Migration. So the greatest impact of the Great Migration is it's going to allow African Americans by the millions to escape just the wrath and racist laws of the South. And of course, that equity is going to not be great at first, but it is going to lead to some economic mobility and African Americans gaining more money and resources. And that's going to lead to opportunities and, of course, a higher standard of living. It's just a small step and a first step, but it is in the right direction. So that's going to be a positive. Now, what is the legacy of everything we talked about? Well, World War II, the United States did, excuse me, the United States did start going a different path during World War II. So the efforts of A. Philip Randolph spreading his ideas that equality should happen, the March on Washington, is really going to wake up African Americans and white supporters to say, you need to protest, stop giving up. And they're going to get ready to do exactly that as we move into the 50s and 60s, into those protest time, as they go after Jim Crow and segregation. So another aspect of the Tuskegee Airmen is African American pride. With the success that they had, African Americans are going to begin feeling better about themselves. When you feel better and have higher self-esteem, you're willing to take on more challenges, including all of American society. So it is going to inspire lots of people to fight on and create equity. Once you know that you can win, and getting rid of segregation and the military was a win, you know you can go after other ones, and people are going to slowly change their minds. Now, another aspect, part of this legacy, is the debt that America owed African Americans. Many African Americans said, I'm going to risk giving up my life to fight, but I want equity when I come home. I want equality. And it certainly wasn't delivered in any hopeful way, but to some extent, that's exactly what happened by African Americans basically fighting in the military, that much of American society is going to slowly be like, you know what, we owe it to them. Let's give them rights bit by bit. They're going to have to be hard-fought rights, but it's going to happen. And we'll talk about that in one of our next units coming up. So that said, Hitler ultimately, one of the greatest legacies, of course, when we're fighting against Hitler, is it's going to really, really highlight the contradictions between our democracy and racism, right? We were the country that was supposed to be good. We're the ones saying we're fighting against fascism and prejudice, and yet there was so much prejudice in our society. It basically made our country face our own racism. and that's going to set us up for a fight in the 50s and 60s. So definitely a little bit crazy. Now, this is just the start, right? Maybe the greatest legacy of A. Philip Randolph and African Americans in World War II is it mobilized African Americans to get ready to fight. And that fight is just beginning and ultimately going to come to a peak point during the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, which is one of our future units. So we'll study that when we get to it. But the African American serving is going to start changing American society, and we're going to get on a different path. And that's a good thing, particularly with the civil rights movement on its heels. Well, thank you for paying attention as we've gone over many aspects of African American roles during World War II. Pay attention in the future for future screencasts. Thank you very much.